I didn't plan to be standing on the sidewalk that morning, my entire career stuffed into a cardboard box like it was nothing more than junk from a garage sale. The late autumn wind sliced through my coat, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to remind me how small and exposed I was. Across the glass doors of Grayson and Company, my former colleagues were gathered in the lobby. They weren't looking at me, at least not directly, but I could feel their glances, the way people look at a car accident. Through the tinted glass, Carl was laughing. Not just a polite chuckle. It was that smug, full-bodied laugh that made his neck veins pop and his tie jiggle against his shirt. The laugh he used when a client complimented my work and he pretended it was his. I stood there, frozen, gripping the box harder until the edge dug into my palms. My coffee mug, the one my daughter painted with crooked blue stars when she was 6, rattled inside. Carl didn't see me at first. Then he turned, just enough for our eyes to meet. No words, just a look. The kind that said, "You lost. I won." I wanted to storm back inside, slam that box on his desk, and tell everyone exactly what kind of man he was. But instead, I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind you give someone right before you pull the rug out from under them. Because Carl thought firing me would ruin me. He didn't know he'd just signed his own pink slip. It's strange how quickly a career can vanish. 10 years of early mornings, late nights, weekends sacrificed, birthdays skipped, all erased with a 15-minute HR meeting and a printed letter. But if you really want to understand how I got here, you have to go back. Back before the cardboard box. Before the smug laugh. Before Carl even knew my name. It was 3 months earlier when I first noticed the change. Grayson and Company wasn't a flashy place. We weren't one of those tech startups with ping-pong tables and cold brew taps. We were an old-school consulting firm. Dark wood furniture, glass offices, the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering no matter how many times the pot was changed. I'd been there since my late 20s. I knew the clients, I knew the contracts, and I knew how to keep the machine running. Back then, Carl was just another manager, the kind who cared more about golf than quarterly reports. But something shifted when he got promoted to director. It was like someone flipped a switch. Suddenly, he was everywhere. In my client calls, CC'd on my emails, showing up in meetings he'd never cared about before. At first, I thought it was oversight. Then I realized he wasn't just watching me. He was collecting. My contacts, my work habits, my pitches. And then came that laugh. The laugh I'd come to know so well. The morning of the firing didn't start like a disaster. It started like any other Tuesday, until my phone buzzed with a call from my daughter's school. I remember exactly where I was. Halfway through an email to a new client, the cursor blinking at me like it knew what was coming. "Mr. Turner? This is the school nurse. Emily has a fever of 102. She's asking for you." That's all it took. I grabbed my keys and jacket, shot Carl a quick email, "Emergency with my daughter, will be in late," and ran for the parking garage. When I got back 2 hours later, Emily safely tucked into bed with her favorite blanket and a glass of water. Carl was waiting by my desk. "You made it," he said, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "My daughter." "I read your email," he interrupted, then tilted his head like a disappointed teacher. "Family's important, Evan, but so is dependability." I bit back the reply in my throat. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't make a habit of this." And that's when I saw them, the papers on his desk. I wouldn't have thought much of it if I hadn't recognized the letterhead. It was from Clarkson Industries, one of our oldest clients. The top page was half covered, but I could read enough to catch words like exclusive rights and overseas manufacturing. It didn't make sense. Clarkson wasn't supposed to be moving any of their contracts offshore. I filed that away. Back on the sidewalk, cardboard box in hand, I could feel my pulse in my ears. The memory of that day, of the look Carl gave me, was the match to dry kindling. I took one last glance through the glass. His laugh had stopped. He was talking now, serious, leaning in towards some junior associate like he was giving a masterclass in manipulation. And then, something else caught my eye. Across the street, through the drizzle, was the building I'd walked past every day for 10 years, the one I'd barely noticed because it wasn't ours. The competitor, smaller, scrappier, and according to office gossip, struggling to keep its doors open. Only now, I was really looking at it. The name over the door gleamed faintly in the weak light. And an idea, reckless, dangerous, impossible, started to form. The wind picked up, scattering a few brittle leaves across the pavement. I gripped the box tighter, feeling the sharp corner press into my ribs. I wasn't going home. Not yet, because Carl might have taken my job, but I was about to take something he couldn't get back. It all started with one late morning, and a secret Carl hoped I'd never find. And that secret? It was sitting right there on his desk, plain as day, 3 weeks before everything blew up. That's where the Real story begins. If you'd asked me a year ago whether I trusted Carl, I probably would have said yes. Not enthusiastically, but the way you trust a guy to water your plants while you're on vacation. You don't think he's going to burn the place down, but you also don't expect him to send you photos of the flowers blooming. When I first started at Grayson & Company, Carl was just there. He'd hover in the break room, always wearing those pastel golf shirts under his blazer like he wanted people to think he was relaxed and successful at the same time. He wasn't a bad manager back then. In fact, I remember him covering for me once when my wife went into labor with Emily. But somewhere between his promotion to director and the company's push to modernize operations, he changed. His eyes were always darting, scanning, like he was constantly checking a scoreboard no one else could see. My own track record at the company was spotless. 10 years. Not a single missed deadline. Clients who'd been with us since before I joined asked for me by name. When new hires came in, they shadowed me. I'd stayed late more times than I could count, often walking out into the empty parking lot under those flickering orange lamps, wondering if I'd even see my daughter awake that night. And speaking of family, I'd be lying if I said my career didn't put strain on my marriage. One night about a year before Carl's promotion, my wife, Sarah, was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and bills spread out like a deck of bad cards. Emily was coloring at the counter. I was trying to explain to Sarah why I couldn't take the weekend off for her cousin's wedding. "You work for a consulting firm, Evan, not the Secret Service," she said, voice low but sharp. "It's a big client," I told her. "If I don't show up." She cut me off. "Then they'll learn the world doesn't revolve around them." I remember looking at Emily, her tiny hands smudging blue crayon across the page, oblivious to the tension in the air. That's when I told myself the late nights were worth it. For her future. For our stability. At least, that's what I believed back then. The first red flag with Carl came on a Tuesday. I'd just wrapped up a call with a client in Chicago, leaning back in my chair, stretching the stiffness out of my neck. "Hey, Evan," Carl said, strolling into my office without knocking. He had that fake casual way of talking, like he was about to compliment you and insult you in the same breath. "Good call," he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Looks like they're ready to sign the new contract next week." "Perfect," he said, and then, this is the part that made my stomach tighten. He asked for the final proposal draft. "Sure, I'll email it to you," I said, thinking he just wanted to review it. 2 days later, I found out he'd already presented it to the board as his own work. No mention of my name. Not even a hint. That was the first time I noticed the shift in the office. People started going to Carl with things they used to bring to me. He began showing up in client meetings I'd scheduled. At first, I chalked it up to him taking a more active role after his promotion. But one afternoon, I caught a junior associate, barely 6 months on the job, parroting my exact talking points from a strategy session to Carl. And Carl just nodded along like it was brand new information. Then there was the matter of the company next door. Brighton Consulting. Smaller than us, but not by much. They had one major account keeping them afloat, Westland Manufacturing. I only knew this because years ago, Brighton had poached a client from us, and Carl had ranted about them in the break room for weeks. In recent months, though, Brighton had gone quiet. No big wins, no flashy announcements. I'd pass their building every morning on my way in and notice fewer cars in the lot. Sometimes, I'd see their receptionist staring out the window, looking worried. The Clarkson Industries documents I saw on Carl's desk that day, the ones mentioning exclusive rights and overseas manufacturing, had nothing to do with Brighton. At least, not directly. But they felt off. Clarkson was one of our oldest, most loyal clients. If they were considering sending work overseas, that would cut jobs. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. The fact that Carl had those papers and I hadn't heard a word about the deal made my skin prickle. It wasn't long after that the attendance threat started. I'd been 5 minutes late one morning because the freeway was shut down after an accident. Carl called me into his office. "Traffic," I explained, still holding my coffee. "Maybe try leaving earlier," he said. smiling like he'd just given me a nugget of wisdom. It wasn't about the lateness. It was about control. The last normal day I had at Grayson was a Friday. I'd just finished setting up a pitch deck for a new client we'd been chasing for months. I stayed late that night, later than anyone else, fine-tuning every slide. When I left, the office was quiet except for the hum of the vending machine in the break room. I remember glancing out the window and seeing Brighton's building still lit up. Someone was working late over there too. I didn't know it yet, but that building was going to be my second chance. The Monday after, Carl was different, more confident. He had a lightness in his step, like a man who'd just won something. I found out later he had, but not in the way he thought. Back at home that week, Sarah asked me if I'd thought about looking for other jobs. "You've been there a decade," she said, folding laundry on the couch. "Maybe it's time. Carl's not going to be in charge forever," I told her. But deep down, I knew I was lying. Not to her, to myself. The morning everything started to spiral, the morning Emily's school called, I didn't hesitate. I left my half-written email open, grabbed my coat, and ran for the elevator. Carl's face when I got back said it all. "You made it," he said, in that slow, deliberate way, like he was savoring the words. I told him about Emily. He nodded, said family was important, and then added, "But so is dependability." I should have walked away right then. But instead, I noticed those Clarkson documents. The words exclusive rights burned into my brain. That was 3 weeks before the cardboard box. 3 weeks of Carl circling me like a shark. 3 weeks of clients suddenly reassigned to other managers. 3 weeks of me wondering what the hell he was up to. And then came the day he took my biggest account, the one I'd nurtured for years, and presented my proposal as his own. I didn't find out until a colleague whispered it to me in the hallway. "Evan, they just approved Carl's plan for Stonebrick Logistics," she said. "My plan," I corrected automatically. She just gave me a look, pity mixed with warning. That's when I started keeping my own records. Emails, drafts, client call notes, all backed up on a personal drive. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with them yet, but something in my gut told me I'd need them. And I was right. Which brings me back to that afternoon on the sidewalk. Cardboard box, the sting of cold air, Carl's smug face, and the building across the street, Brighton Consulting, staring back at me like it had been waiting all along. I didn't know much about running my own firm, but I knew Carl. I knew his weaknesses, and I knew one thing for sure. If I could find the right leverage, I could make him feel everything he'd made me feel. And I had a hunch that somewhere between Brighton's struggling books and those Clarkson documents on his desk was the crack in his armor. I stepped off the curb toward my car, my pulse steady now, my mind racing. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to make Carl regret underestimating me. And I had no idea just how fast the first piece of the plan would fall into place. The night after Carl fired me, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch with the TV on mute, the bluish light flickering against the walls, and my laptop open in my lap. Sarah had gone to bed hours earlier, though not before giving me that look, the one that was equal parts concern and "I told you so." Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Carl's face. Not the bored, half-listening expression he wore in meetings, but the smirk he'd given me through the glass as I carried that box out. I kept thinking about Brighton Consulting across the street. Their lights were still on when I left that afternoon. 2 silhouettes moved past the windows, fast, agitated. I wondered if they were fighting to save their company or just fighting to get through the week. And then, like a whisper in the back of my mind, the thought came, if Brighton's hurting, maybe they're open to new leadership. The next morning, I drove Emily to school. She was still pale from the fever, but insisted she felt better. Her small hand squeezed mine before she hopped out of the car. "Are you going to work today?" she asked. I hesitated. Something like that. Her brow furrowed the way it always did when she sensed I wasn't telling the full truth. She didn't press, just waved and ran inside. Instead of heading home, I parked a block away from Brighton's building. From this angle, I could see the faded lettering on their front window. The paint was chipped, the gold flaking off like old leaves. Not a great sign. A man in a wrinkled shirt came out, holding a cardboard folder bulging with papers. He lit a cigarette, exhaled like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and then got into a car that coughed to life. Every detail screamed struggling, and if they were struggling, maybe they'd be willing to listen. But I couldn't just walk in there empty-handed. I needed more than a pitch. I needed leverage. Something that would make me impossible to ignore. That's when the Clarkson deal came back into focus. 3 weeks earlier, the day Emily got sick, I'd seen those papers on Carl's desk. Exclusive rights. Overseas manufacturing. Clarkson wasn't supposed to be touching offshore production. It would break their Made in America promise, and if their customers found out, it could wreck them. So why was Carl sitting on it? That same afternoon, I had gone back to my desk and pulled up our internal client files. Sure enough, there was no mention of Clarkson's offshore plan. No memos. No meeting notes. Nothing. Which meant either Carl was working this deal under the table, or he was hiding it until the ink was dry. Neither option was good for the company, but both could be very good for me. I started digging. Quietly at first, just poking through the public business filings, news releases, trade journals. One late night, I found a small blurb in an industry newsletter, the kind of thing only insomniac procurement managers read. It mentioned Clarkson's exploratory talks with an overseas manufacturer in Shenzhen. The article was dated 2 months ago, so Carl had known about this for a while. I closed my laptop slowly that night, my mind already racing ahead. If I could connect Clarkson's offshore move to Carl, and to the fact that he'd kept it quiet, I'd have a bargaining chip. Not just for revenge, for positioning myself in Brighton's eyes as someone who knew where the bodies were buried. The tricky part was time. Brighton could be circling the drain any day now, and I didn't know how long before Clarkson's move went public. I needed to act fast. 2 days later, I saw Carl at the coffee shop down the block from Grayson and Company. He was alone at a corner table, talking into his phone with that fake friendly voice he used when he was selling something. Can make the transition smooth, no disruption to your delivery schedules, he was saying. No need to involve the board yet. I'll handle everything personally. I didn't need to hear the other side to know exactly who he was talking to. That night at dinner, Sarah noticed I was quieter than usual. You've got that plotting face on, she said, twirling pasta around her fork. Plotting? She raised an eyebrow. The one you had when you built the tree house in the backyard without asking me. I smirked. This time it's bigger than a tree house. The next morning, I called an old friend, Marcus. We'd started at Grayson together, but he'd left 5 years ago to work in finance. If anyone knew how to evaluate a company on life support, it was him. Brighton Consulting, he said when I told him. Yeah, I've heard they're bleeding cash. You thinking of working there? Something like that, I said. There was a pause. Evan, you sound like you're up to something. I am. We met for coffee that afternoon. I slid my notes across the table, client rosters, public filings, the Clarkson leak. Marcus scanned them, his brow knitting tighter with each page. You realize if this goes south, you're going to war with your old company, right? He said. I didn't blink. Carl declared war first. Over the next week, I shadowed Brighton from a distance. I learned their CEO, a woman named Linda Holt, had been running the place for 15 years. She was sharp, respected, but tired. You could see it in the way she walked, shoulders slightly hunched, like the weight of every payroll check was pressing down on her. I also learned Westland Manufacturing, their biggest account, had been shopping around for other firms. If they jumped ship, Brighton would be done. And Carl? He'd been sniffing around Westland for months. The pieces started fitting together in my head. If I could bring Brighton something they needed, protection from losing Westland, plus insider knowledge about Carl's Clarkson deal, I could make myself invaluable. And if I could make myself invaluable, I could get a seat at the table, maybe even the head. But that's when something happened that nearly blew my whole plan apart. It was a Thursday morning. I was sitting in my car outside Brighton, pretending to scroll my phone while I watched the entrance. Carl walked out. Not from Brighton's door, from a side alley that led to their back parking lot. He was with another man I didn't recognize, tall, mid-50s, wearing a Westland Manufacturing jacket. They shook hands, both smiling like cats who'd found the cream. My stomach dropped. If Carl was meeting with Westland behind Brighton's back, then Brighton was even more vulnerable than I thought. And if Westland left them before I could make my pitch, Brighton wouldn't need me, because they wouldn't exist. I went home that day with my brain on fire. Sarah noticed immediately. Do you want to tell me what's going on? She asked. Or should I just wait for you to start pacing? I set my bag down and took a deep breath. Carl's trying to kill Brighton, and I think I can stop him. She didn't smile. Evan, you just got fired. Maybe this isn't your fight. It's exactly my fight, I said. Because if I do this right, Carl won't just lose Brighton. He'll lose everything. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing Carl and the Westland guy shaking hands. Picturing Brighton's gold lettering flaking off their window. Picturing Clarkson's offshore deal going public. All of it was a ticking clock. The next morning, I called Marcus. "I need an introduction to Linda Holt," I said. "You sure about this?" I looked out my window at the gray, washed-out sky. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. By noon, Marcus had set it up, a quiet meeting at a diner on the edge of town. I rehearsed my opening line in the car. I knew I had one shot to get her attention before she wrote me off as just another out-of-work consultant looking for a pity hire. I gripped the steering wheel, the adrenaline buzzing in my fingertips. Because in 20 minutes, I was going to walk into that diner and tell Linda Holt exactly how we could save her company and destroy Carl in the process. And I had no idea that Carl was already 2 moves ahead of me. The bell over the diner door jingled as I stepped inside. It smelled like bacon grease and coffee that had been sitting in the pot too long. The kind of place where regulars have their booth and the waitresses know your order before you open your mouth. Linda Holt was already there, seated at a corner table. Her posture was perfect, but her eyes looked like they hadn't rested in weeks. She stood when I approached, extending a hand. "Marcus said you had something I should hear." "That's putting it lightly," I said, shaking her hand. We sat. A waitress poured coffee without asking, the steam curling between us. I didn't waste time. "Carl Atwood," I began. Her brow twitched, but she didn't interrupt. "He's meeting with Westland Manufacturing behind your back," I continued, trying to pull them away from Brighton. "And that's not all. He's also sitting on a deal with Clarkson Industries to move production overseas. If it goes through, they'll break their Made in America promise, and you know what that'll do to their reputation." Linda leaned back, studying me. "That's a lot of accusations for someone I've just met." I pulled out my folder, the one I'd been building for weeks, and slid it across the table. "Not accusations. Documentation." She flipped through the pages, her nails tapping lightly on the paper. "Where did you get all this?" "I worked at Grayson for 10 years, I said. "I know Carl's playbook, and I know he won't stop until he's buried you." Her eyes flicked up to mine. For the first time, there was something there. Not trust exactly, but interest. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Let me help you keep Westland. And in the process, we'll make sure Carl never plays this game again." She didn't say yes right then, but she didn't say no either. Instead, she closed the folder and said, "Meet me at Brighton on Monday. If you're serious, you'll have a plan." I left that diner buzzing with adrenaline. It felt like the first real win since Carl had tossed me to the curb. I spent the weekend putting together a strategy. How Brighton could secure Westland with improved service, better pricing, and public goodwill. I even drafted a few PR angles to quietly expose Clarkson's offshore move at just the right time. By Sunday night, I had it all packaged in a sleek presentation. Monday morning, I pulled into Brighton's parking lot 5 minutes early. The building looked the same as it always had, faded lettering, tired facade, but now I saw it differently. This wasn't just a struggling company. This was the weapon I could use to take Carl down. Inside, the receptionist, a young woman with a ponytail and a guarded smile, led me to the conference room. Linda was already there, along with 2 other executives I hadn't met. "This is Evan Turner," she introduced me. "He has some ideas for keeping Westland." I was halfway through my pitch when the conference room door opened, and in walked Carl. He didn't even look surprised to see me, just smirked like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Well, this is awkward," he said, pulling out a chair without being invited. Linda's gaze darted between us. "Carl, what are you doing here?" "Westland asked me to sit in," he said smoothly. "They're considering multiple options, and I'd hate for Brighton to make promises it can't keep." It was a knife wrapped in politeness. I pressed on with my presentation, but Carl was a constant interruption, questioning numbers, clarifying facts, dropping subtle digs about my employment history. By the time I wrapped, I could feel the sweat between my shoulder blades. Carl leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. "Interesting approach," he said. "But I think Linda knows by now that Grayson can offer Westland far more resources than Brighton ever could." The meeting dissolved into polite goodbyes. Linda didn't commit to anything. As I walked out, Carl followed me into the parking lot. He waited until we were out of earshot before speaking. "You really think you can play in my league?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm not playing," I said. "I'm winning." He smiled, that same smug smile from the day he fired me. "We'll see." 2 days later, I found out just how far he was willing to go. Linda called me into Brighton's office. Her voice was tight, controlled. Evan, I got a call from Westland's VP this morning. Carl told them you were terminated from Grayson for cause. Something about falsifying client reports. My stomach dropped. That's a lie. I believe you, she said. But you understand how that looks to a potential client. Carl hadn't just undercut my pitch. He'd gone for my credibility, my name. That afternoon, I got a call from another old client, one I'd been quietly courting on Brighton's behalf. Evan, I don't know what's going on between you and Grayson, he said. But Carl told me to be careful about working with you. Said there were integrity issues. My hands were shaking when I hung up. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. Carl wasn't just trying to win Westland. He was trying to make me unemployable. And for the first time, I understood something important. This wasn't about business for him. This was personal, which meant it was going to get personal for me, too. That night, I told Sarah everything. She listened without interrupting, then said, "So what are you going to do?" "I'm going to hit him where it hurts," I said. "Not just his job, his reputation, his power." She frowned. "Evan, you're talking about war." I met her eyes. "No, I'm talking about justice." The next morning, I made 2 calls. One to Marcus, one to a journalist I'd once helped with a client background piece years ago. And by the time I hung up, the first real strike against Carl was already in motion. I didn't know it yet, but within a week, the cracks in his perfect facade would start to show. And I'd be the one holding the hammer. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I couldn't sleep, though that was true, but because my mind was buzzing like a live wire. Carl thought he'd crush me by poisoning my name. What he didn't realize was that all he'd done was light the fuse. If I was going to take him down, it had to be precise. Loud enough that everyone saw the fallout, but quiet enough that he never saw it coming until it was too late. First call, Marcus. I need you to dig into Brighton's numbers, I told him. See what it would take to get a controlling share. There was a pause on the other end. You're serious about this? As a heart attack. He exhaled slowly. You know that's not pocket change. Even if they're struggling, buying in would take serious capital. I'll find it, I said. Second call, the journalist, Caroline Briggs. We'd crossed paths years ago when she'd been chasing down a corporate fraud story, and I'd quietly slipped her the breadcrumbs she needed. She owed me. When I told her about Clarkson's offshore deal, she went quiet. That's big, she said finally. If it's true, it's going to blow up in their face. Oh, it's true, I said. And I can prove Carl knew about it. She chuckled, low and sharp. Send me what you've got. And Evan, I'll make sure when this hits, it's front page. With those 2 pieces in play, I turned my attention back to Brighton. I needed Linda on my side completely, not just as a potential ally, but as a partner. So I showed up at Brighton's offices with coffee and a folder labeled Operation Lock-In. Her eyebrows lifted when she saw it. Lock-in what? Westland, I said, sliding into the seat across from her desk. And your future? The plan was simple, at least on paper. Step 1. Rebuild Brighton's pitch to Westland with data Carl couldn't match. Not generic promises, but concrete operational changes. Faster turnaround, custom reporting tools, even a dedicated liaison team. Step 2. Leak Clarkson's offshore plan right before Westland's decision deadline. With Carl scrambling to do damage control, Brighton would slide in as the safe, reliable alternative. Step 3. Secure a contract so favorable to Brighton that Carl's attempt to poach Westland would look like a desperate, amateur move. Linda listened without interrupting, her fingers drumming against the desk. When I finished, she said, "This is risky." I leaned forward. "So, is letting Carl gut your biggest account? The question is, do you want to survive, or do you want to win?" She didn't answer right away, but when she finally spoke, there was steel in her voice. "What do you need from me?" That night, I worked late in Brighton's conference room, the hum of the vending machine in the hallway my only company. Every so often, I'd glance out the window at Grayson and company across the street. Lights still on in Carl's office. His shadow pacing. I imagined him thinking he was untouchable. Good. Let him believe that just a little longer. By Friday, Marcus had numbers for me. "If you want a controlling share, you're looking at mid-6 figures," he said. "Maybe less if you catch them desperate. But you'll need investors." "I can get them," I said, though I had no idea how. He gave me a skeptical look over his coffee mug. "You're planning to gamble everything on a company that's barely keeping its head above water." "I'm not gambling on the company," I said. "I'm gambling on me." Over the weekend, I started making calls, old clients, ex-colleagues, even a couple of quiet venture guys I'd met at networking events years ago. I didn't pitch them Brighton as it was. I pitched what it could be, a lean, aggressive player with an inside track to one of the most valuable accounts in the sector. By Sunday night, I had commitments for half the amount. Enough to make me dangerous, but not enough to close the deal. Meanwhile, Caroline was working her side. She called me Monday afternoon. We're almost ready. But I need one more thing. Proof Carl personally knew about the Clarkson deal before it went public. I smiled. I've got just the thing. Buried in my personal drive was an email Carl had sent me 3 months ago, marked confidential. He'd attached a market analysis for Clarkson's future operations, complete with offshore cost projections. I forwarded it to her without a second thought. Tuesday morning, I found out Carl was getting nervous. One of my old contacts at Grayson called me. He's asking a lot of questions about where you've been, who you've been talking to. Looks like you've rattled him. Good, I said. Let him rattle. Linda, on the other hand, was moving faster than I expected. She'd pulled together her operations team, hammered out the logistics for Westland's new service model, and even prepped a mock-up of the custom reporting dashboard. This is good, I told her. Really good. We're not going to half-measure this, she said. If we're going for Carl, we go for the throat. I couldn't help but grin. I knew I liked you. The pressure was building on all sides. Carl was circling Westland like a vulture. Caroline's piece was almost ready to drop. Investors were watching closely. And then, just when everything was lining up, I got a call that nearly made my stomach drop through the floor. It was Marcus. Carl's making a move, he said. Word is he's offering Westland a short-term contract at cost. He's trying to lock them in before Brighton can get to them. I pinched the bridge of my nose. When he's meeting them Thursday. That gave us exactly 2 days. I called Caroline. We need the Clarkson piece to run Wednesday night. That's tight, she said. Tight is fine. Just make it happen. Wednesday evening, just after 8, the story went live. Clarkson Industries exploring offshore production despite public pledge. Carl's name wasn't in the headline, but it was all over the body, highlighted as the Grayson executive personally advising Clarkson on the move. By 9, my phone was lighting up with texts from industry contacts. By 10, Linda called. Westland saw the story. They're asking if we can meet Friday morning. I smiled into the dark. Tell them yes. Thursday morning, I walked past Grayson's building. Through the glass, I saw Carl on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. He didn't notice me. Good. Friday morning, I sat in Brighton's conference room while Linda led the presentation. We didn't just pitch Westland on staying. We pitched them on a future they couldn't get anywhere else. When it was over, their VP shook my hand. We'll be in touch. Not a yes. Not yet. But his grip was firm, and there was no mistaking the shift in his tone. By Monday afternoon, Linda called me into her office. They're signing, she said. 2 years. Higher rate than we expected. They want to start next month. For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of it sinking in. Carl had lost Westland. But the game wasn't over. Because I wasn't finished. Marcus's voice crackled through the phone that night. With Westland on board, Brighton's valuation just jumped. If you're still serious about buying in, now's the time. I looked out my kitchen window at the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. I'm not just buying in, I said. I'm taking the wheel. And in the back of my mind, I could already see Carl's face the day he realized who owned the company next door. The morning I signed the papers, the air felt sharper. Like the world itself knew something was about to change. The conference room smelled faintly of new carpet and stale coffee. Brighton's lawyer sitting at the head of the table, Marcus to my left, Linda to my right. The folder in front of me was heavier than paper should ever feel. This makes it official, the lawyer said, sliding the pen across to me. My hand didn't shake as I wrote my name, but I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. Owner, partner, majority shareholder. Brighton was mine. When I stepped out into the street afterward, the winter sun was bouncing off the glass windows of Grayson and Company, blinding. I pulled my coat tighter and stared up at the top floor, Carl's office. From this angle, I couldn't see him, but I imagined him there, leaning over his desk, barking orders, completely unaware that the game board had already flipped. Step 1 of the execution was public visibility. We rebranded Brighton overnight. New logo, fresh website. A launch announcement that didn't just celebrate Westland's contract, but teased major expansions to come. The press release hit inboxes before Carl even had his second cup of coffee. I knew because Marcus texted me a screenshot of Carl's internal email to his staff. Find out what Brighton is planning. Now, step 2 was targeted pressure. Through a couple of old contacts, I arranged for Brighton to poach 3 of Grayson's mid-tier clients in the span of a week. Nothing huge enough to cause panic, just enough to make the floorboards creak under Carl's feet. Linda played her part perfectly, calling me late one night to say, "He's losing his temper in meetings. Staff turnover's spiking. He's starting to look desperate." Exactly what I wanted. The final step, the kill shot, had to be public. I didn't just want Carl to know I'd beaten him. I wanted everyone in our industry to see it, to remember it every time they thought about pulling the same stunt on someone else. So I waited. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't about speed. It's about timing. That timing came 2 weeks later at the annual Regional Business Forum, the kind of networking event where suits trade cards, big fish sniff out smaller ones, and every move is a performance. I made sure Brighton sponsored the opening breakfast. Not just a logo on the banner, but a full keynote slot. And I made sure I was the one giving it. When I stepped onto the stage, the crowd was a sea of blazers and tablet screens, coffee cups in hand. And there, in the third row from the front, was Carl. He hadn't seen me yet. He was flipping through the program, frowning at the Brighton logo. "Good morning," I started, letting my voice carry through the ballroom. "Some of you may know me from my time at Grayson & Co." That got his attention. His head snapped up so fast it almost made me laugh. "But I'm here today in a different capacity, as the majority owner of Brighton Consulting." A ripple went through the crowd. Carl froze. I didn't look directly at him. Not yet. I talked about Brighton's new direction, our expanded team, the systems we were putting in place to make clients' lives easier. I made sure to mention Westland, and the fact that they'd signed a 2-year deal with us, despite considerable pressure to take their business elsewhere. That was the first time I let my gaze slide to Carl. He was stone-faced, but his knuckles were white against his armrest. When the applause came, it was polite but warm. I stepped off the stage, shaking hands, fielding congratulations. Carl was waiting. "Enjoying the free breakfast?" I asked as I passed. His jaw tightened. "This isn't over." I smiled. "It is for you." And I walked away before he could reply. From there, it snowballed. The forum buzzed with Brighton's announcement. By the end of the week, we'd picked up 2 more mid-size contracts, both from clients who'd been unhappy with Grayson for months but hadn't had a reason to leave until now. Carl sent out a memo to his staff about redoubling client loyalty efforts. I didn't need to see it to know he was bleeding. But I wasn't done. Because Carl's biggest asset wasn't his client list, it was his reputation. That's where Caroline came in one last time. She called me on a Thursday afternoon. "You might want to be sitting down for this." The piece she'd been holding back, the one with the leaked internal emails from Grayson's leadership about their long-term plan to offshore multiple client projects, was going live that night. "Carl's name is on almost every thread," she said. I didn't ask her to delay. By Friday morning, Carl's LinkedIn profile had been quietly updated to open to work. By Friday afternoon, rumors were circulating that the board was considering new leadership to restore public trust. By Monday, Carl was gone. The strange thing was, I didn't feel triumphant in the way I'd imagined. There was satisfaction, sure, a deep, quiet sense of balance being restored. But as I stood at my office window that evening, looking across at the darkened top floor of Grayson & Company, I realized the real victory wasn't Carl's fall. It was that I was still standing, stronger than before. Then Linda knocked on my door. "You might want to see this," she said, handing me her phone. It was a photo, grainy, taken from across the street. Carl, in a wrinkled suit, leaving the building with a single box under his arm. The look on his face was unreadable, but I could almost hear the echo of his own words from that day in the boardroom. "Sometimes, Evan, you're just not the right fit." I handed the phone back to her, my mouth curling into a slow smile. "Oh, Linda," I said, "we're just getting started." And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't over yet, because Brighton had momentum now, and I intended to use every ounce of it. Carl was gone, but the empire he'd tried to build on my back, I was about to take that too. The first Monday without Carl felt quiet, not just in Brighton's office, where the hum of printers and muted conversations filled the space, but out there in the whole industry. No sharp-tongued memos from Grayson & Company, no aggressive client poaching, no petty digs in trade publications. It was like the air itself had cleared. I sat at my desk, flipping through the morning paper. Buried on page 6 of the business section was a small headline. Grayson and Company appoints interim CEO following leadership change. No quotes from Carl. No warm send-off. Just a flat, 3-paragraph announcement that his time there was over. I traced the black ink with my thumb and thought about all the mornings I'd once come into that same office, fueled by hope and caffeine, believing that hard work would shield me from politics and egos. Turns out, hard work is just the foundation. You still have to fight to keep the house standing. Linda popped her head in. The Westland team's here for their quarterly review. I smiled. Send them in. The meeting was productive, easy even. They liked our systems, praised our response times, hinted at expanding their contract next year. When they left, one of the junior associates whispered, "It's crazy how fast Brighton's grown under you." I didn't correct her. I just said, "We're not done yet." But the growth wasn't just about the business. It was me. A year ago, I'd been blindsided, humiliated, made to feel replaceable. Now, I was walking into rooms, and people were leaning forward, listening. My decisions carried weight. My name opened doors instead of being quietly pushed out of them. It wasn't ego. It was the awareness that I'd rebuilt myself from the ground up. Still, the part of me that had lived through that boardroom ambush couldn't help but keep tabs on Carl. Through the grapevine, I heard he'd taken some consulting gigs. Smaller companies, out of state. No big headlines. No splashy comebacks. Someone said he'd been offered a teaching role at a local business school, but turned it down. Someone else swore they'd seen him at a mid-tier trade show, standing alone near the coffee table. I never reached out. One afternoon in spring, months after his departure, I left the office late. The sun was low, washing the city in gold. As I crossed the street toward the parking garage, I saw a figure leaning against the railing. It was Carl. No suit jacket, tie loosened, hair a little longer than I remembered. He didn't look surprised to see me, more like he'd been expecting it. "Evan," he said, almost warmly. "Heard Brighton's doing well." I studied him for a moment. "We are." He nodded, eyes flicking to the street. "Guess you got what you wanted." I let the silence hang before answering. "No, Carl. I got what I deserved." His jaw shifted, like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Take care of yourself." Then he walked away. I stood there for a long moment, watching his figure disappear into the crowd. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't pity either. It was clarity. He'd thought of the game as one winner, one loser. But in the end, he'd been playing for survival. I'd been playing for something bigger. A few weeks later, Brighton hosted a charity gala, the kind of event Carl would have scoffed at, calling it good optics, but a waste of resources. We raised enough to fund 3 community business grants. Standing at the podium that night, looking out over a room full of clients, partners, and staff, I realized my revenge had evolved. It had started as a plan to take something from him. Now, it was about building something he could never touch. After the speeches, I stepped outside for some air. The city lights glittered against the dark river, and the hum of music from inside faded behind me. Linda joined me, holding 2 glasses of champagne. She handed me one. "To Brighton," she said. I clinked my glass against hers. "To moving forward." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water. Then she smirked. "You know, Carl's name doesn't even come up anymore." I took a slow sip and let that sink in. That was the real end. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in my office. The skyline glowed through the windows. My desk was littered with empty glasses, scattered notes, and the faint scent of cologne from guests who'd stopped by to congratulate me. I picked up my old Grayson and Company ID card, the one I'd kept tucked in a drawer. The photo was faded, the plastic scratched. For a moment, I considered tossing it in the trash. Instead, I slipped it back into the drawer. Not as a trophy, not as a wound, as a reminder. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about revenge. The best kind isn't about the other person at all. It's about refusing to stay small just because someone else tried to shrink you. Carl had given me the push, a brutal, humiliating push, but I'd chosen the direction. And I'd keep choosing it. When I turned off the office lights and stepped into the hallway, the air felt warm, almost like summer was coming early. I didn't look back.